3,000 years ago in ancient Greece, something very strange happened. A cultural revolution began, a true eruption of creative energy, a volcanic eruption that was happening in the minds of the Greeks. Allow me to show you what I mean with specific examples. For this, we will need to literally move from Greece to ancient Egypt for a second. Look, here is an Egyptian sculpture from the Old Kingdom period. And here is another one, this time from the New Kingdom period. There are several thousand years between them, yet the difference is minimal. Yes, of course, Egyptologists can distinguish them, but for most people, they are roughly the same. In this sense, Egyptian culture turned out to be very inert, very static. Yes, it changed, but not very quickly and not very willingly, it seems. Now let's return to Greece. Here is an archaic Greek sculpture, the so-called Kouros. This is approximately the 7th century BC. As you can see, the anatomy is quite simple. The body's position is static, arms at the sides, legs straight. And here is another Greek sculpture, quite famous. It's Laocoon and his sons, characters from the Trojan mythological cycle. Look at the complex composition before us. 3 human bodies intertwined with the writhing bodies of snakes. What has come down to us is most likely a copy, because according to descriptions, the original sculpture was made from a single piece of marble. Consider the complexity of the task. Carving all these rippling muscles, all these writhing snake bodies, while ensuring that no cracks form in the stone and that no piece breaks off, as that would ruin the entire work. And yet the 3 sculptors who worked on this masterpiece succeeded. Consider the tremendous progress the Greeks made in just 300 to 400 years, progress that Egyptian culture either could not, or perhaps did not want to, achieve over several thousand years. It is truly a miracle. And the well-known Soviet historian, Alexander Zaitsev, referred to this phenomenon in his book as the Greek miracle. In the history of art, there is only one era that could compare in terms of the intensity of development and its significance. And that is, of course, the Renaissance. But here's what's strange. For some reason, even those of us who are not specifically interested in art, just within the framework of general culture, have an understanding of the Renaissance era and the people who created it. But the same cannot be said about Greek culture and Greek art. If I ask you who first began to depict living human emotions during the Renaissance, you will at least remember Leonardo da Vinci. Here, the Madonna is not just playing with the child, she is laughing, she is smiling. But there was a famous Greek sculptor who also made a real revolution by starting to depict fear, surprise, and despair on the faces of his heroes. And for some reason, we do not remember his name. If I ask you which Renaissance artist first began to play with the viewer by intentionally distorting the proportions of their figures, you will probably remember Parmigianino and his famous Madonna with the long neck. That's what it's called. But he had an ancient predecessor, a sculptor who also elongated the arms and legs of his figures to create a certain mood for the viewer. And his name, too, we usually forget. If I ask you which Renaissance sculptor first began creating fully round compositions, ones that the viewer must walk around, you might recall Giambologna and his Rape of the Sabine Women. Indeed, this sculpture cannot be viewed from a single angle. It needs to be walked around. Or perhaps you might remember Bernini and his David throwing the stone. This is also a round sculpture. You also need to walk around it to get a complete impression of it. But even in this case, Bernini and Giambologna have a Greek predecessor, and we don't know him either. This is very unfair in my opinion, and I am going to correct this injustice right now. My name is Alexei Pashkov. I am a historian and art historian, and in today's lecture, I will tell you about 4 Greek sculptors, each of whom made a real revolution, without which the art as we know it would not exist. I must tell you that the Greeks themselves had more sculptors that were mandatory to study, at least 6. I won't have time to talk about all of them today, because the story you are about to hear is an excerpt from a more comprehensive course on ancient art. The full course is available in the Art Enthusiasts Club, the link to which is below this video. And if you enjoyed today's lecture, then once you finish listening to it, I hope you will follow that link and at least read the club's description, find out what awaits you inside and how to join. And I really hope to see you inside. Now let's move on to the greatest Greek sculptors. After this, a revival gradually begins. Yes, a return to life. Cities reappear, large centers of ceramic production and navigation reemerge. And it is at this moment that the formation of the civilization we call classical antiquity begins. So when we talk about ancient Greece, we are referring to this period. During this time, from the 8th to the 6th century BC, the era usually referred to as the Archaic period. Yes, the Archaic, meaning the ancient era. Greek art is just taking its first steps. And the first steps are the kouroi. Kouros in Greek simply means a young man. And art historians have adapted this term kouros to denote these kinds of sculptures. Hundreds, if not thousands, of them have been preserved. And they are all absolutely uniform. A young man of athletic build, undoubtedly. The shoulders are always wider than the waist. He stands with his arms at his sides and his legs usually take a step. That is, the legs are not placed together, but one leg, usually the right leg, is in front. So it's as if it is stepping forward. But of course, this step is absolutely unconvincing from an anatomical point of view, if only because the stepping leg is usually extended. Well, we don't walk on straight legs, we bend them slightly. But this is archaic. These are still quite primitive sculptures. Where did the idea for such sculptures come from? It's absolutely clear. It came from the East. After all, the Greeks at that time were already trading extensively with Egypt and Turkey. Well, modern day Turkey, of course. If we look at Egyptian sculptures, we will see exactly the same scheme. But the big difference between Egyptian culture and Greek culture is that Egyptian culture turned out to be surprisingly conservative, static. As you know, the history of ancient Egypt spans several thousand years, and throughout all these millennia, this canon, once developed, practically did not change. Yes, of course, Egyptologists in principle can distinguish works from, for example, the Middle Kingdom from the New Kingdom. But this difference is very subtle, almost imperceptible to the ordinary person's eye. Egypt did not change. It was as if it was frozen. But with Greece, everything turned out differently. Greek art, at some point around the 5th century BC, began to develop very rapidly, and within just 200 years, made a real revolution. This rapid development, this cultural volcanic eruption, is sometimes referred to by historians as the Greek miracle. There was a well-known Russian historian and classicist named Zaitsev. He wrote a book that is called The Greek Miracle. Indeed, an explanation for why such a creative tsunami occurred specifically in Greece still does not exist, although it is a very interesting question. And by the way, I tried to find an answer to it in a more detailed course on the history of ancient art, which I also have and which you might want to refer to later. So, what are the Greeks doing? They are trying to bring the kouroi to life, because let's agree, what you see before you, by the way, is a famous kouros. This is the so-called Apollo of Tenea. Sometimes kouroi are called Apollos. This is a conventional name. That is, in reality, we do not know if a god is depicted here, or for example, a winner of the Olympic Games, or some local hero. It's unclear. So Apollo is a purely conventional name. This is certainly an athletic young man, but depicted very schematically. He looks a bit like a robot. The Greeks wanted to breathe life into him. And if we start to examine the evolution of kouroi in detail, we see how they indeed become more and more lifelike. For example, their heads start to turn, an arm is raised, a leg is slightly extended forward, the hips are slightly rotated. Look at this sculpture. It is usually called the Apollo of the Tiber, because it was retrieved from the bottom of the Tiber River. This is an intermediate stage, right? Here you see that the body is already just becoming quite mobile, the arm is raised, but still something is missing. One more small step was needed for these sculptures to truly start feeling alive, like living bodies. And this step was taken by the great Greek sculptor named Polykleitos, made around the 5th century BC. The era of Polykleitos is the era of the so-called High Classical period. I must tell you that the very peak of Greek civilization, this very High Classical period, occurred between two wars. First, the Greco-Persian Wars. A favorite joke among historians, right? An exam question for a passing grade. Who participated in the Greco-Persian Wars? I don't know. So, the Greco-Persian Wars, if you remember your school history curriculum, were two Persian campaigns against Greece in an attempt to conquer it. Both campaigns failed. Do you remember the famous Battle of Marathon? The 300 Spartans. These are all events of that war. And of course, the victory in the war led to an incredible spiritual uplift and undoubtedly to a flourishing of the arts. This flourishing lasted for about 100 years. But then, at the very end of the 5th century BC, the Peloponnesian War broke out, which was a war between Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states of ancient Greece. This war led to the defeat of democratic Athens. Sparta emerged victorious, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because Greece's resources were depleted. It became politically fragmented. Another 100 years of civil wars followed, after which Alexander the Great came and restored order everywhere. And so, the period from the Greco-Persian Wars to the Peloponnesian War is referred to as the High Classical era, the 5th century BC, roughly speaking. And the period from the Peloponnesian War to Alexander the Great is called the Post-Classical era, roughly speaking, the 4th century BC. So, there you have it. The era of high classical art is opened by Polykleitos, about whom we know practically nothing, except that he was the creator of this sculpture. I ask you to take a closer look at it, because this sculpture is truly a revolution, a breakthrough, a great leap forward for art. It is called Doryphoros. Doryphoros in translation means spear bearer. Well, you see, he clearly had something on his shoulder. On his shoulder, yes, apparently it was a spear. What did he feel here? Polykleitos discovered here. He found a new angle. More precisely, not even an angle, but a new pose in which he placed his hero. Look at how Doryphoros stands. I will stand like that now, and you will understand what I mean. He is leaning on one leg. It is straight, and it is tense. The other leg is relaxed. We also often stand like this. Well, when we are waiting for a bus, for example, right? We lean on one leg and then shift to the other leg if we get tired. Notice that my supporting leg is the right one. And to maintain balance, I slightly lift my left shoulder forward. Not forward, but upward. So, the left shoulder is a bit higher than the right one. For me, just a little. This position is called contrapposto. Yes, contrapposto, which means opposition, right? So, the supporting leg and the opposite shoulder are always higher and slightly protruded. This position actually became classic almost all later. Sculptures depicting, for example, orators or emperors who are simply standing before their subjects, they are all in this position, right? They are all in contrapposto. And indeed, remarkably, a figure depicted in contrapposto, it looks like very lively. We feel, although the Doryphoros doesn't seem to be running anywhere, we actually don't even understand. Is he walking or standing? It's unclear. Maybe he is shown as if taking a step, or perhaps he is standing still. But in any case, we feel that we are indeed looking at a living body. Notice that Apollo of Tiber, whom I just showed you, did not have this. Both of his feet were pressed to the ground. Whereas here, one leg, yes, is placed on the tiptoe. So where does this sense of vitality, liveliness come from? I think the point is this. In a living organism, all parts of the body are interconnected. When you take a step, it's not just your legs that are involved. Your shoulders slightly move from side to side. You slightly swing your arms to maintain balance. In a living organism, Everything is interconnected. And this pose, contrapposto, it precisely highlights this interconnection. It was not present in the kuroi. The kuroi were similar to robots. The legs step, but the shoulders and arms do not participate in this. And we intuitively feel a living body does not behave this way. Polykleitos, who invented contrapposto, truly managed to bring stone to life. And this is his greatest achievement. Even for this alone, his name could remain in the history of art forever. But Polykleitos, apparently wanting to be on the safe side, did something else. This is Alexei Pashkov again, and I want to interrupt myself for just a second. I will now tell you what else Polykleitos came up with. But first, I want to draw your attention to one unfortunate circumstance, likely related to you. Many years ago, I worked as a tour guide at the Hermitage. The Hermitage has 3 floors, and at that time, the first floor housed the antique collection, the second floor had paintings from the Renaissance and Baroque periods, and the third floor featured Impressionists and later paintings. The floor area, as you can imagine, is the same. The richness of the collections is also roughly comparable. Yet there were disproportionately few people on the first floor. Very rarely did my clients express a desire to go down there, and if they did, they would quickly rush through those floors. Why is that? Why do most people, even those interested in art and who visit museums, have a sort of blind spot when it comes to antiquity? It's understandable why. The fact is, viewing sculpture is indeed more challenging than viewing paintings. It requires a certain habit, a certain skill, and certain knowledge. No one ever taught us this. And as a result, a very unfortunate situation has developed. After all, different people visit museums for different reasons and are generally interested in art for different purposes. Some seek inspiration, vigor, and energy in art, and art is capable of providing all of this. And some visit museums to escape from the mundane and routine, and art can provide that distraction. Some seek self-development, new knowledge, while others go out of curiosity. People are interested in how world culture has evolved. And I understand this perfectly. I myself belong to this category. And you must agree that in any case, whatever you seek in art, to take one of the most important periods in its history, antiquity, crumple it up and throw it away, saying it's complicated, uninteresting, we don't know how to appreciate sculpture, or it's upsetting, it's daylight robbery. And I would like to correct this situation. If you realize that you also have a kind of gap for which you are not to blame, but which you would nevertheless very much like to fill with something, then I invite you once again to the Art Appreciation Club, the link to which you will find below this video. There is a huge amount of material on ancient art, and not only on it. The lectures are short, so you won't need much time to study. 15 minutes a day is enough, but they are very rich in content. After you familiarize yourself with them, your perception of art, both ancient, medieval, and Renaissance, will reach an entirely new level. Therefore, I, once again, invite you, after you finish listening to the lecture, to follow the link and at least read about the materials available in the club, the opportunities participation in this club offers you, and what else awaits you inside. Well, now, let's return to our Polykleitos. He, well, according to later accounts, wrote a book. This book was called Canon. Canon, meaning a collection of rules. The book itself has not survived to our time, but we know that it discussed proportions, the proportions of the ideally beautiful human being. Again, we do not know all the proportions that Polykleitos outlined, only some. Well, it is known, for example, that according to Polykleitos's canon, the height of the head from the crown to the chin should be 1/7 of the total height of the body from the crown to the floor. And in the same way, the sizes of all parts were interconnected. For example, the length of the arm from the shoulder to the fingertip, yes, if I'm not mistaken, is 8 palm lengths from the base of the palm to the middle, to the end of the ring finger, and so on. There is a version according to which the Dorophoros is
precisely the model of this very canon. That is, the Doryphoros might very well have been, do you know what it's called now? A template for sculptors. Do it like this. Well, actually, you understand that the original of this sculpture has not survived to us. What has reached us are its later Roman copies. And by the way, the same situation applies to all the other Greek sculptures I will be talking about. The originals have not survived, but these sculptures were very popular and were often copied. And these are the copies we know. So the measurements of these copies show that yes, indeed, their actual dimensions mostly match those described in Polykleitos' book. And if this is the case, then it seems that Polykleitos was indeed the creator of a very important idea for ancient art, the idea of harmony, the idea that beauty is the correct proportion at the sum of dimensions, and that beauty is closely linked to mathematics. This idea, by the way, seems to be characteristic specifically of European civilization. In the East, it never really gained such popularity. But all ancient art, or more precisely, the thought about art, yes, it always revolves around the idea of proportions. Of course, these ideas were applied to architecture to a greater extent. For example, Roman treatises on architecture, Vitruvius' treatise, first and foremost. There, more than half of the book is dedicated to the question of how many diameters of the column should be in the height of the column. Yes, that is the relationship between the height of the column and the width. Yes, how many diameters of the column should make up the distance between two adjacent columns, and so on. That is the entire ancient temple. It's as if all its details are interconnected by this system of proportions. And its inventor was precisely Polykleitos. Remember, I mentioned that in the development of art, there is its own logic, and that the art of different civilizations, different eras, often goes through the same stages, the same phases. So, the contrapposto is a perfect example. For Greek sculptors, the discovery of the living human body, a body that breathes, runs, fights, moves, began precisely with contrapposto. And the same thing happened during the Renaissance. One of the breakthrough moments in the history of the Renaissance is considered to be the creation of the doors of the Florence Baptistery, doors created by the sculptor Ghiberti in the early 15th century. So, look, this is one of the bas-reliefs from those very doors. Well, these are huge bronze gates covered with bas-reliefs. This is the baptism of Christ. Look, he is also standing in contrapposto. Yes, we don't see his legs, they are hidden by the water, but the entire posture of the body is very reminiscent of the posture of the Doryphoros. Therefore, for Renaissance sculptors, the ability to depict the living human body was also largely the starting point. Yes, mastering this skill became the discovery, or rather the rediscovery of contrapposto. Since we are talking about patterns in the development of art, there is another pattern that will reveal itself to us right now. Very often, artists and sculptors, of course, first engage in solving, let's say, formal problems. How to depict the body so that the hands, legs, nose, ears, everything is in place, so that the muscles have the correct outline, and so on. And so, as you understand, the Greek sculptors of the 5th century, the sculptors of the High Classical period, solved this problem. After this, the next question arises: how to depict what is inside? How to show the internal through the external, the spiritual, through the physical? How to depict emotions? How to convey character? And this is what they begin to focus on in the next stage, in the era of the late classical period. Interestingly, the choice of thoughts and emotions is also very characteristic. As I mentioned, Greece of the late classical era is a society that has already passed its peak and is now in decline. A massive civil war between Athens and Sparta. Well, civil because Greeks are fighting Greeks. After this, there were constant disputes within the Greek states, a constant fear that Macedonia might come and conquer everything. And indeed, that's exactly what eventually happened. The fall of democracy, the replacement of democracy with dictatorship, with tyranny. All of this, of course, could not help but be reflected in the art, and it was reflected. What do people usually want in times of crisis? Many want to forget, to escape into a world of fairy tales, into a world of fantasy. This is called escapism. Escapism was apparently very characteristic for the Greeks of that time, and there were sculptors who tried to satisfy this demand. The most famous of them was undoubtedly Praxiteles. Look at this work of his, Resting Satyr, a very popular sculpture. About 70 copies have reached us. That is, it was often reproduced. It is masterfully executed. It's clear that he has an excellent command of anatomy. And this rather complex position of the body, which is tilted, stretched diagonally, he managed it beautifully. But at the same time, look, there is nothing heroic here. Muscles here and there here. He has a well-groomed, even slightly full body. This is not the body of a hero, not the body of a warrior. It's the body, I would say, of a hedonist, a person accustomed to a comfortable, well-fed and pleasant life. A person who loves to enjoy life. And look at his face. How self-absorbed and pensive it is. Such a slight smirk, it seems to me, a bit sly, a bit arrogant. This face expresses a lot, unlike, for example, the face of the Discobolus. Look at him. The face of the Discobolus is a mask. It's the face of a soldier in an honor guard. It is courageous, but it expresses absolutely nothing. The face of the satyr already expresses a lot. This shift, this change, is a very characteristic phenomenon of the late classical period. But of course, Praxiteles entered history not only with his satyr. He is the one who created probably the most memorable female image. An image that influenced the entire subsequent history of European art. According to legend, Praxiteles was commissioned to create a sculpture of Aphrodite by the inhabitants of the island of Kos. Not Kos, sorry, Kos, the island of Kos. And Praxiteles offered them two options to choose from, one clothed and one completely nude. The people of Kos chose the clothed version, fearing to choose the nude one, because until then, no one had created nude female sculptures. This is an important point. Nude male sculptures existed. By the way, there are often questions about why the Greeks depicted their heroes nude. As you understand, in reality, they did not walk around naked. It's warm in Greece, but not that much. The question of the reason for this nudity is a separate issue. Yes, of course, one could say they had a cult of the beautiful body, but that's a somewhat, let's say, simplified answer. I also delve into this in detail in my course on antiquity. We won't dwell on this now. But in any case, apparently, for a long time, this nudity among the Greeks was associated with heroism, with the status of a great warrior, with the status of a hero. Accordingly, for women, it seemed not very appropriate. And so the sculptors got scared. They decided to show conservatism, solidarity, and chose the clothed version. And they miscalculated because the nude version went to the island of Knidos and became famous. The depiction of the Cnidian Aphrodite, which itself has not survived, can be found on coins and amphorae. Apparently, these were souvenirs that people took away from this island. And we know that already in the Roman era, many people traveled specifically to Knidos to see this sculpture. That is, it became a magnet for tourists. Knit flourished thanks to her. There is a legend, according to which a certain young man from Knidos fell in love with this sculpture. And since this love, by definition, was unrequited, he eventually ended his life. He threw himself into the sea. I repeat, the Aphrodite of Knidos itself has not survived, but numerous Aphrodites have been preserved, which were apparently made based on its motifs. Here is one of them. This type of Aphrodite is called Aphrodite Anadaiomene. Aphrodite Anadaiomene, meaning Aphrodite rising from the sea, or Aphrodite the bather, to put it simply. Well, as you remember, according to legend, Aphrodite was indeed born from sea foam, and this moment was played up by Praxiteles. He depicted her on one hand, seemingly as a goddess, and on the other hand, as an ordinary bather who is coming out and taking a cloth to wrap herself in. But she hasn't managed to wrap herself yet, and we see her body. And there's this expression, right? a playful body. Well, sometimes people say about a beautiful woman that everything about her is playful. This is exactly that kind of case. Look, the shape of Aphrodite's body resembles a zigzag. Her head is turned one way, while her neck is slightly inclined in another direction. Her shoulders are here, her hips are there, and her legs are back over there. Her entire body is like a wave. And because of this, it seems alive. It appears sensual. It seems trembling. I think you already understand. I like Praxiteles' Aphrodite, both as an art historian and, let's be honest, as a man. This image of Aphrodite, I repeat, it turned out to be encoded, so to speak, in European culture. Time and again, artists of later periods return to this very image. Here, for example, it is a painting by a French salon artist of the 19th century called The Pearl and the Wave. Well, judging by the title, it's not Aphrodite, but inspired by her. And here's what's interesting. Do you remember Manet's Olympia? This painting caused a scandal because it depicted, well, supposedly a prostitute. A prostitute is not allowed. But Aphrodite, even if she is as naked as the day she was born, is allowed because it's elevated. It's an ancient myth. But a real prostitute is base and banal. But simultaneously with Praxiteles' work, there was another line, another trend, directly opposite to him. Remember, I posed a question a little earlier. What do people want during times of hardship and crises? Many want to escape from reality, yes, but many want, on the contrary, to express everything that's on their minds. People are in pain, people are scared, people are in despair, and they want to scream about it. And there are always artists who try to do exactly that, who want their paintings to scream. By the way, there are wonderful parallels in more modern art. Think of the early 20th century. On one hand, it's a time when, for example, the pre-Raphaelites are working, creating fairy tale worlds. But on the other hand, it's a time when Munch is working and his famous The Scream. However, we will talk about this later. Let's return for now to ancient Greece, to the artists who could probably be called the ancient Greek equivalent of Munch. Yes, I understand that this is a very bold comparison, but nevertheless, this is Scopas. His most famous work, by the way, is a sculpture that has been very poorly preserved. It has neither arms nor legs, and yet it is famous. Here it is. This is the Maenad. Maenad is a Greek word which translates to mad woman. Maenads, or Bacchae, were the names given to women who were followers of the cult of Dionysus, or Bacchus. As you understand, Dionysus is the Greek version, that Bacchus is the Roman one. We all know Dionysus as the god of wine and merriment, but this is in fact also a simplified view of him. The cult of Dionysus was orgiastic. There are numerous descriptions of how his followers, us mostly women, leave the cities, go into the forests or mountains, and conduct secret rituals there. These rituals are accompanied naturally by libations. They drink wine, but not only that. They engage in dance. It is a fast, rhythmic dance to the beat of drums. And with these dances, wine and music, they bring themselves to a state of ecstasy. They fall into a trance. In this state, they acquire, well, you can't say supernatural abilities, but abilities that go beyond what is usual for a person. They become extremely physically strong and at the same time bloodthirsty. The cult of Dionysus was apparently associated with a subconscious attraction to violence and death. There are numerous depictions of how the Bacchae tear apart goats or rabbits or hares with their hands. And there is also an absolutely stunning tragedy by the famous ancient Greek tragedian Euripides called the Bacchae. It is so gruesome and bloodthirsty that I won't even retell it to you, but if you want, read it yourself. And so the Bacchante of Scopas, she is apparently usually called a Maenad, yes, a madwoman. She apparently depicts just such a follower of the cult of Dionysus who has fallen into a frenzied state. Here she is, take a look. This is a woman whose body twists and coils like a spiral. She has thrown back her head. She seems to be howling. She is clearly in an ecstatic state. And yes, I repeat, she has neither arms nor legs, but apparently, when they were present, she was depicted in some such position. Perhaps she held a dead animal in her hands. This sculpture is important for two reasons. Firstly, it is one of the earliest attempts in the history of Greek art to express negative emotions. Fear, despair, madness, bloodthirsty frenzy before Scopas. No one had done this. He was the first. And the second important point, this sculpture is probably one of the first to be fully round. What does this mean? Now, recall earlier works. Remember the Doriforos. The Doriforos could only be viewed from one angle, the front. Now, technically you could look at it from the back too, but there's nothing interesting at the back. The same goes for the Discobolus. Yes, it might seem that the Discobolus also twisted his body, but in reality, there's only one good viewpoint for the Discobolus, from the front, because his twisted body is essentially within some invisible plane. That is, if you look at it, for example, from the side, you'll only see the top of his head and a shoulder. Look from the back, well, you'll see his back. But all the most important aspects, yes, the muscle tension, the body position, its twist, all of this can only be appreciated by looking at it frontally. Accordingly, such sculptures were most likely placed either in a niche or against a wall. Well, because it's silly to place them in the center of a square, it's pointless to look at them. From behind, yes, there's nothing there. Conversely, it's impossible to view the Bacchante from just one point. Because no matter from which point you look at her, you won't see her body in its entirety. You will always see only part of the face, just one hand or one leg, because she is twisted. To get a complete impression of her, you need to walk around her. And that's precisely why she cannot stand in a niche. She should stand in the center of some room. In fact, again, speaking of parallels between ancient Greece and later times, during the Renaissance, we will see the same thing. Sculptures will also gradually and rather timidly free themselves from the dominance of the wall or niche where they were previously located. I'll give you two examples. Both sculptures were created by Donatello, again, the famous Florentine sculptor of the early 15th century. We will talk more about him in the following lectures. Look, here's his early work, St. George. St. George seems to still be standing in a niche, but look, he has already slightly turned his shoulders, turned his whole body, and it seems as if he is about to step out of this niche. He is taking the first very tentative steps towards becoming independent from the wall to which he is leaning. And here is Donatello's later sculpture, Judith with the head of Holofernes. Well, this is from the Bible, from the Old Testament. Judith infiltrates the camp of the general Holofernes, who besieged her city, intoxicates him, and then beheads him. So look, this sculpture is completely round. It needs to be viewed from all sides. Because if you, for example, look at Judith from the front, you cannot see Holofernes' head, as the face is turned to the side, and you cannot see his legs, as they hang over the opposite side of the pedestal. This is clearly done on purpose. Donatello invites us to examine his sculpture from all sides. So here too, as you can see, the logic of development is the same. The sculpture becomes fully three-dimensional, completely round, and increasingly independent. It does not cling to the wall. It boldly steps out into the open square, or the center of the hall, or the center of the temple. And of course, the third sculptor of the late classical era that must be mentioned is Lysippos. Among all the people we talked about today, Lysippos is the only person about whom we know something. From a human perspective, some anecdotal details about him have survived. We know that Lysippos was the favorite sculptor of Alexander the Great. Moreover, only Lysippos was allowed by Alexander to depict him. We know that Lysippos was extremely prolific. He worked a lot, and according to one legend, each time he completed a sculpture, he would drop a small precious stone into a vessel. After his death, the vessel was broken, and more than 1,000 precious stones were found inside. Well, of course, the most interesting legend is the one about how Lysippos was tricked. According to the legend, He promised a certain courtesan, almost certainly Thais of Athens, who was, if you remember, a companion of Alexander the Great. He promised to give her any of his sculptures of her choice. She asked him, "Which one do you consider the most valuable?" Naturally, the cunning Lysippos did not answer her, because apparently he didn't want to part with the most valuable one. Then the courtesan decided to deceive him on her part. One day, they were sitting and feasting, when suddenly a slave of Lysippos, bribed by her, runs in and shouts, "Master, master, disaster, there's a fire in the workshop." Lysippos jumps up, grabs his head, and cries out, "If Eros is lost, then everything is ruined." Well, that's the sculpture of Eros he was working on, the one he has there. And in this way, the courtesan understands that it is Eros he considers his most talented work. It's a small detail, but agreeably, such little anecdotal details already bring his figure to life for us, and they make it much more interesting. As for his work, the sculpture you absolutely need to know is Hercules. This is how it looks. But again, this is not the original. We know that the original was made of bronze, and it has not survived. This is a later marble copy. In fact, the copy is not the only one. There are many such Hercules sculptures. This sculpture was also very popular, and it remains popular to this day. It is called the Farnese Hercules, named after the Italian Renaissance collector to whom it belonged. And I repeat, it is very often copied. In St. Petersburg alone, well, I'm from St. Petersburg, as you know. So if you also live in St. Petersburg, for example, you can count how many copies of this sculpture are in the palaces and parks of St. Petersburg. For instance, I can name, I think, 5. Well, not less. What makes the Farnese Hercules remarkable for us? On one hand, by its incredible physique, it is the embodiment of the ancient concept of a hero. Although this concept, I must tell you, changed somewhat during the late classical period. If we look at earlier works, well, at the same Discobolus or the Kouroi, then yes, undoubtedly, they are athletic, they are muscular, but they are still quite functional, I would say. They are not so much mighty as they are agile, fast, lean. They are, lean. Heracles is like a huge, cumbersome machine. His muscles are excessive. No, probably at that time you could find such a model in reality. After all, I repeat, professional sports were already developed. But still, probably most Greek athletes did not look like that. It's an exception, maybe even an exaggeration in some ways. Lysippos tries to show that we are looking at a hero demigod. I remind you, Heracles was the son of Zeus. But what is also remarkable is that, look, on one hand, he is mighty. But on the other hand, this power of his is absolutely useless. It's as if it is shackled. He is mortally tired. Look at how he leans on his finger. Look at how his finger points down powerlessly. It's as if he is hanging. Why is he tired? It's clear. If we look at him from behind, we will see that in his hand, which is brought behind his back, there are 3 apples. These are the apples of the Hesperides. As you remember, Hercules performed 12 labors. In the last one, or the penultimate one, it varies. There were the golden apples of the Hesperides. In order to obtain them, he had to hold the sky on his shoulders. So here, Lysippos shows us Hercules, who has completed his service. All the labors are done. He can rest. And it's clear why he is so exhausted. But many classical art historians write that this also expresses a certain spiritual fracture, a certain weariness of the era. That is, the Greek civilization itself seems to be still flourishing. Wealthy cities, enormous temples, high culture, all of this exists. But the internal strength is already gone. And soon this civilization will be absorbed by Macedonia, which will come and conquer everything. Its heroic era is in the past. Many draw parallels here. Well, it's hard to say how valid these parallels are, but in any case, this Hercules also became in many ways a prototype, or rather an archetype of a hero. In all subsequent European culture, the hero will mainly be exactly like this. Physically powerful, yes, enormous. That is, Lysippos in this sense created such a model. If we return once more to the idea of the direction in which art usually develops, we will understand that it develops in the direction of enhancing successfully found solutions and the constant search for new ones. In general, the pursuit of novelty is probably a characteristic of any art at all times, because artists, being creative people, are not interested in repeating what has already been done before. They want to find something new, something of their own. And we have seen how in an earlier era, when depicting athletes, sculptors, let's say, restrained themselves. They depicted them as muscular, powerful, heroic, remained realistic. Lysippos, he is probably balancing somewhere on the edge of realism. His Heracles is, well, seemingly a living person, but I repeat, it's hard to believe in him. It's hard to find such a machine in real life. Even modern bodybuilders, I think, could envy him. And the next stage in the development of ancient art, known as the Hellenistic era, well, Hellenism is usually referred to as the period after Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great, as you understand, conquered half the world and kind of spread ancient, that is Greek, yes, Hellenic culture throughout the world. And from Alexander the Great to the conquest of all this by Rome, which mainly occurred in the 1st century BC, this period is called the Hellenistic era. So here it is. The Hellenistic era became the time when ancient art surpassed this peak, past a certain critical point, and began to slide into fantasy, hyperbole, and exaggeration. And probably the most remarkable example of Hellenistic art is the group Laocoon and his sons. Well, the story about Laocoon, the Hellenistic era, Roman portraits, the further development of ancient art, and how it will transform into medieval art awaits you at the link below. All these materials are available in the Art Enthusiasts Club, and I am sure that if you watch this lecture to the end, you will definitely find it interesting there, and you will surely find something for yourself.
The club is a giant library of knowledge about the history of art. There are more than 300 lectures. There are 4 courses on antiquity alone. There is an adult course on ancient art, a snippet of which you have just listened to. There is an adult course on ancient literature, which complements the art course. You become acquainted with both visual arts and the works of ancient writers. There is a separate course on ancient philosophy, or more precisely, specifically on Stoic philosophy. It's not only interesting, but also useful in our times. Finally, there is a children's course, Ancient Myths in Art, where I both talk about Greek mythology and immediately show how different artists depicted various stories in different eras. Double the benefit. By the way, this course, although it is designed for children aged 7 to 12, judging by the reviews, many adults enjoy it too. And these are just the courses about antiquity. There are also courses on medieval art, the Northern Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, the Baroque era, and some other materials on various topics. Of course, there are membership fees that all club members pay. It costs 990 rubles per month. But for those who are entering the club for the first time, I naturally have a softer, let's say, offer so that you can simply try it out, look around, and decide if it suits you or not. If you live in Russia, then the first month of club membership will cost you 100 rubles. I think such an amount is a risk that everyone can afford to take. If you are abroad, then I have specially duplicated all the club materials on Patreon for you. And in this case, the first week of participation will be free for you. Well then, $10 a month. Therefore, I invite you to take a look inside, get acquainted with the materials, and feel the atmosphere of participating in this community of people who are genuinely interested in art and culture. If you like it, stay. I will be very glad. If you don't like it, simply do not renew your membership at the end of the first month. I hope to see you inside. And in any case, here, on the open internet, we will see each other soon as well. Goodbye.